Hey, welcome to the VHS Tapes podcast, bitch. Tonight's episode is Outhouse of Horror 2. Venom and Heroicus, unknown to them, are trapped in my dream world, and I'll be forcing them to read horrifying tales. If they don't wake up screaming, they won't wake up at all.
Amidst the mists and fiercest frosts, with barest wrists and stoutest boasts, he thrusts his fist against the posts, and still insists he sees the ghosts.
A 13-year-old girl was left home alone. The parents thought that she was too old for a babysitter, so they decided that she should stay home as long as she locked all the windows and the doors as soon as they left. Usually, she would have objected to being left alone. However, her parents had brought her a beautiful German Shepherd dog just weeks before. The reason for such a gift was because the girl had been suffering from nightmares for years. Having the dog sleep in her bedroom helped her feel at ease. When her parents left, she went home around the house, making sure that all the windows and the doors were as per her order. She found the basement door would not lock, so she locked the door leading into the house instead and thought nothing more about it. The time was 8 p.m., and she thought she was to go to bed at 10 p.m. It was just enough time to watch a film, so she put on her favorite movie and settled down to watch it. The dog came by and laid at her feet for the length of the film. Feeling happy that she coped well with being alone at night, she decided she better head off to bed. Turning off all the lights on her way upstairs, she saw nothing unusual. Once upstairs, she brushed her teeth and changed into her pajamas. She snuggled under her blanket and dropped her hand to the floor to feel for her dog. Sure enough, he assured her of a presence with a loving lick. She smiled and drifted to sleep. In the midst of the night, she was awoken by a dripping sound. Rolling her eyes, she assumed that she didn't turn off the faucet in her bathroom. Trying to ignore it, she felt for the dog and relieved the lick that she was used to receiving, and she went back to sleep. Only a half hour later, she woke up again to the dripping, and knowing that it kept waking her up, she woke up, got up from bed, and headed to the bathroom to turn off the sink, leaving the light off in order to not blind her eyes that were still half asleep. She tightened the tap and returned to her room. Feeling for her dog, she was greeted by the usual lick. Tremendously tired, she fell back to sleep, didn't wake until her parents returned home. The lights from the car shone through her bedroom window. She was pleased that they were home. One thing shocked her, though. The dripping sound was still going. Worried that perhaps the tap had broken, she walked to the bedroom to investigate forward. She turned on the light and her scream pierced the silence. Her parents ran up to the bathroom to investigate her troubled screams, and they stood there staring in the bathroom. There was their beautiful dog, skinned and hanged in the shower, with blood dripping to the floor. On the mirror was the words, "Humans lick too."
A young bachelor at the beginning of his career became very successful very quickly, so he bought himself a house. One morning, he awoke to the sound of running water. He rushed to the bathroom and saw that the bathtub faucet was running on full blast. He was perturbed by this, as he lived alone. A week later, it happened again. Only this time it wasn't just one faucet. It was all of the faucets in the house. The young man called a repairman to fix the pipes and water damage. But as it turned out, the pipes weren't broken. The repairman, a local, seemed visibly shaken. "What's wrong?" the bachelor asked. "The woman who lived here before you," said the repairman. "She drowned in that bathtub." An executive went on a business trip for her company. When she arrived at the hotel, she got the key card for her room, 213, and went straight up. She was exhausted and couldn't wait to sit down, but her key card didn't work. She went down to complain to the front desk and promptly got a new card. That one didn't work either. Just as she was storming off to go back to the lobby, the door to her room creaked open. A little boy had opened the door. He was standing in the dark. She went to the front desk again. "There's another family in my room," she said to the man. "No, that's impossible. No one has checked in but you."
Without, the night was cold and low. But in the small parlor of Labyrinth Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned. Like father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical chance, putting his king into sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady, placid, knitting by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amicably desirous of preventing his son from seeing. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly, surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check. I should hardly think that he's come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied his son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked for violence. "All the beastly slush out of the way places to live in. This is the worst. Paths of bog and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are left. They think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a giddly grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly and the sun was up. Footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste and opened the door. He was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with him, so that Miss White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye, a bug to the visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major took hands and, taking the pre-offered seat by the fire, watched contently as host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got bright and began to talk. The little family circle regarded with eager interest this visitor from a distant part as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes, doughty deeds, war and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have much charm, said Miss White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man. Just to look around a bit, you know. Better where you are, said Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and ferrets, jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw, said Miss White curiously. Well, it's worth just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said Sergeant Major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absentmindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then sat it down again. His host filled it for him again. To look at, said Sergeant Major, fumbling his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket, pre-offered. Miss White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. What is there something so special? Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, examined it, placed it upon the table. Had a spell put up by an old fake, said Sergeant Major. A very holy man. He wanted to show the fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 different wishes. His manners were so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter had jarred somewhere. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Miss White. I did, said Sergeant Major, his glass tipped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes. Yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at least. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I propose, he said slowly. I did have some interest of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused me enough mischief. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale of some of them. And those who do think any of it want to try it first and pay me after. You could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly. Would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and dangled it between his forefinger and thumb. Suddenly threw it upon the fire, white with a slight cry. Stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier's son. You don't want it, Mr. Morris, said the other. Give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire like a sensible man. The other took his hand and examined his possession closely. How did you do it? He inquired. Hold it up to your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. I warn you of these consequences. Sounds like Arabian Nights, said Miss White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught by the. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. Weiss dropped it back into his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us, said Hobart, as the doors closed behind their guest, just in time to catch the last train. You shan't make much of it. Did you give anything for it, Father? Inquired Miss Wright, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, carefully slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. He pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy, wish to be an emperor, father to begin with, then we can't be unpacked. He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Miss White, armed with the anti-mask. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. Seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, won't you, said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200, then. That'll just do it. His father smiled shamefacedly at his own credibility, held up the talisman at his son with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. Fine crash from the piano greeted his words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried with a glance of disgust as the object lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. Must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done. But it gave me a shock at all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever. The old man started nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual depressing settled on three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the rest of the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night. Something horrible squatting on top of your wardrobe, watching you as you filled your pocket with ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, seeing faces. The last was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. Got so vivid that with an uneasy laugh, he fell on the table glass containing a little water to throw at it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked. And the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose all old soldiers are the same, Miss White said. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, Father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Morris said these things happen so natural, said his father, that you might, if you so wish, contribute it to coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avarice man, and we shall all have to disown you. His mother laughed and followed him to the door, watched him down the road and returned to the breakfast. Was very happy at the expense of her husband's credibility, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock. nor prevent him from referring somewhat shortly to retired Sergeant Majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said as they sat at the table. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. You thought it did, said old lady soothing. I said it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. It just happened. What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200-pound, she noticed that the stranger was well-dressed, silk hat of glossy neatness. 3 times he paused at the gate. Then he walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it. Then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Miss White at the moment placed her hands behind the door and hurried unfastening the strings of her apron. Put the useful article of apparel behind the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her fervently and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of her room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited patiently for him to broach his business. But he was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call, he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trouser. I came from Ma and Megan's. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? Was it? What was it? Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said hastily. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he's not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that, thank God. She broke off as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned on her. She saw the awful confirmation of her fears, the others averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand on his. There was a long sleep. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery? Repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring out the window and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it at something they haven't done in over 40 years since they first started courting. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently into the visitor. His heart. The other coughed, rising slowly, walked toward the window. The firm wishes me to convey their sincere sympathy with you and your great loss, he said, without looking well. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely are obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. The husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum. Its compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his face, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. How much? 200 pounds. Was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, senseless heap, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 mile distant, the old man buried their dead and came back to the house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quick that at first they could hardly realize it. They remained in a state of expectation, as though something else was to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed and expectations gave way to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for they had nothing to do, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he heard tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sounds of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept under a sudden wild cry from his wife, who woke him from it with a start. "The paw!" she cried. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlor on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't I think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she said rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was one not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again." The man sat in bed, flung the bedclothes from his quaking lips. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish, oh my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "Coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned, regarded her, his voice shook. "He has been dead for 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see him then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him towards the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might have bring his manipulated son before him. He could escape from the room seized upon, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall. He found himself in a small passage with the unwoken thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. He was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raises his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fiercely. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the woman and raised the blinds. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flickering larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute afterward, the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but sat silently, listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, he took a box of matches. Striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out. He paused to strike another. At the moment, a knock came so quiet and so stealthy as to be scarcely audible sounded on the door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled into the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back up to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in a shaking tone. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat down in bed. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" She ran into the door, but her husband was before her and, catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let me go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son?" She cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman was a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed up to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice strained and panting. "The bolt," she cried. "Come down. I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing got in. A perfect fuselage of knocks reverberated through the house. He heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came back. At the same moment, he found the paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly. Although the echoes of it were still in the house, he heard the chair drawn back and the door open. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on the quiet and deserted road. And that was The Monkey's Paw by, what's his name? W.W. Jacobs.